Welcome to this podcast on publishing an article and editor's perspective. My name is Carl Stychin, and I'm the director of the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies. I'm also the editor of the journal Social and Legal Studies. This podcast is aimed at PhD students in law, as well as early career researchers. Publication is increasingly important for the career development of postgraduate research students. But it's important that publication should complement the work on your thesis rather than detract from it, and indeed, rather than distract you from the work on your PhD. As a consequence, I would encourage you to develop a publication strategy with your supervisor. My advice is to start small in order to build up your publishing confidence. Book reviews and case comments provide an excellent way to reap the benefits of publication without a great deal of investment in your time. As you gain more confidence, you can make use of your doctoral research. This is sometimes called cannibalizing your research for publication. Thus, you may find as you write your thesis that you have chapters that will work very well as standalone articles. It is perfectly acceptable to try to publish this research in referee journals prior to completion of your PhD. But before you even attempt to submit your work to a journal, I think it's very important that you become familiar with journals in your field. Make sure that you are browsing journals either online or in the library, and also start presenting your work at academic conferences. This is an excellent way to build an academic community of which you are a member. It's also a chance to meet people who are involved in editorial work on journals. They may offer you advice, and they may even suggest that you submit your work to their journal. Once you have a piece of work that you'd like to submit to a journal, you then have to decide where to submit it. This is a process of becoming particularly familiar with your target journal in order to determine its suitability. In order to decide where a manuscript is best submitted, you need to understand that journal. Have you looked at articles which have been published in your target journal? Have you reviewed their website in order to understand the submission process? Have you taken advice from colleagues, from your supervisor, as to whether that journal is a good place for your work? Is your manuscript a good fit for the journal? Can you articulate why you think your manuscript would work well in the journal? As an editor, I receive many submissions of manuscripts where I can't see why a manuscript is a particularly good fit for the journal. This is an important point because you can save a lot of time by submitting to a journal where the fit is obvious. Is your manuscript ready for submission? Before submitting a manuscript, you should have received feedback on drafts from multiple sources, not only from your supervisor, but from other PhD students and other academics with whom you may be working. Get as much feedback as possible and ask yourself whether you've responded to that feedback fully. Is there more work that can be done in order to make your work analytically stronger? After all, you want your research to be as strong as possible before submitting it to the referee process. Is your manuscript sufficiently well written to be submitted to a journal? Is the expression of ideas as clear and coherent as possible? Are there any grammar and spelling mistakes? Have you complied with the journal's house style? This is a controversial point. Some authors are of the view that it's acceptable to offer to put the manuscript into house style once it has been accepted for publication. Some journals are comfortable with this, but others expect a manuscript which has been submitted for peer review to be fully compliant with the house style. I should add that it looks very professional if you've made an effort to ensure that your article fully complies with the house style, even though it can be a bit of a labor-intensive task. The final question you might ask yourself is whether you feel ready for the outcome of the peer review process. Your work will be read and reviewed by experts in the field. Do you feel the work is strong enough to withstand that kind of scrutiny? Well, what happens next? Once you submit a manuscript, following the instructions on a journal's website, your manuscript will first be reviewed by the editor to determine whether it is suitable for peer review. This is sometimes called a desk-based review, where the editor determines whether your manuscript gets through that first gate. The editor will be determining whether the manuscript is obviously a poor fit for the journal. For example, as I edit a socio-legal journal, I sometimes receive manuscripts which are clearly not socio-legal in orientation. If that's the case, I would not send it out to peer review because it will be a waste of everyone's time. However, assuming that you get through that threshold, then your manuscript will be sent to reviewers for the peer review process. Every journal has its own process regarding peer review. But one thing is common to all journals, and that is that you need to wait. Wait until the peer review process is complete. It does take time. I would say that you should expect a minimum of 6 weeks. But it will quite possibly be significantly longer because it's often difficult to get peer review reports back promptly from referees. They are busy people. Certainly, if there's a wait of 2 to 3 months, I think it's acceptable to contact the editor to ask about the paper's progress. After a number of weeks, you will receive the outcome of the peer review process. This usually takes the form of the peer review reports, as well as a cover letter from the journal editor explaining the decision on your manuscript. Every journal is somewhat different in terms of the possible outcomes of the peer review process, but the general categories are as follows. Accept the manuscript for publication as it stands. This is a very rare outcome. Accept a manuscript subject to minor revisions. Well, this is a very good result. The possibility of revising and resubmitting a manuscript, which is often a good result. Or an outright rejection, which is not necessarily such a bad outcome because if the peer review reports are constructive, then they can help you to make your work better. It's very important to be able to interpret the decision you have received. The editor's cover letter should definitely help you to do this. Minor revisions, as I said, is a great outcome. This means that the article is essentially accepted for publication, but it's suggested that you might want to make a few changes which the peer reviewers have indicated. If you receive this outcome, then my advice is that you should get to work to try to respond quickly to those revision requests, but undertake them as fully and fairly as you can. But do try to get the revisions off your desk and back to the editor. The next possible outcome is revise and resubmit. As I said before, this can actually be a very good outcome because many articles that are published start life in the revise and resubmit category. But while revise and resubmit can be a very positive outcome, it can also be a difficult outcome. On first receiving a revise and resubmit, and I speak here from experience, it can be quite distressing because the amount of revision that's being asked for by the reviewers may feel overwhelming. In fact, the amount of revision that's being demanded may seem like you're being asked to write an entirely different paper. My advice is not to rush into a decision as to how to respond to the opportunity to revise and resubmit. Seek advice, particularly from your supervisor, as to how to interpret what you've been asked to do. Take some time. You may reach the conclusion that the amount of work that's being asked of you is more than you can reasonably undertake, and you may decide that the revisions would actually undermine your project. That's perfectly acceptable. It may make more sense to try submitting your work elsewhere, possibly after doing some further work on the manuscript in order to respond as best you can to the points that have been raised. Of course, rejection is tough, and I know that from personal experience as well. But a good editor and sensible peer reviewers will try to be constructive in the feedback that they give you. Although it can be hard, especially when you first receive it, try to remain positive. With time, and sometimes it does take time, you hopefully will be able to see that the reviewers made some good points. And it may be that if you take the work back to the drawing board, you can produce a much better piece that will be accepted elsewhere. Back to resubmission of the revised manuscript. In my experience, the process of revising and resubmitting a manuscript is where many authors fall down. Revising a manuscript will probably require some significant work, and my recommendation is that you not cut too many corners in the revise and resubmit process. Don't resubmit too soon. As an editor, I'm always skeptical if work comes back after only a couple of weeks. Did you really do what was asked of you by the peer reviewers? After all, a revise and resubmit is probably asking you to go back to the drawing board and do some significant work with your ideas. It may require rewriting, further research, more in-depth analysis, or restructuring of the argument. Once you've decided that you've done everything you can, and you really feel that you answered the points as best you can, then you should resubmit. Make sure, though, that you include a cover letter explaining in detail what was asked of you and how you responded. And when I say in detail, I would suggest a point-by-point explanation of exactly what was requested and what you did. You may not be able to do everything that was asked of you, but you do need to be able to say that you did most things, and to be able to explain why you didn't do everything that was asked. It's perfectly acceptable in a revision for there to be points that you felt you simply couldn't answer within the constraints of the paper. But do explain why that was the case. Now, I'm afraid that you have to wait some more because your manuscript has probably gone back for further review. Eventually, you'll receive another decision email. Hopefully your manuscript will be accepted, although it may be subject to further minor revisions. But it may still be rejected. Or you may be asked to resubmit yet again, in which case I would suggest that you stick with it because you're probably getting closer to having the piece accepted. Once your manuscript finally has been accepted, the next stage is proof checking, which will happen some weeks further down the road. I think that receiving the proofs of your article is the best part of the process. It's a real feeling of accomplishment. But check the proofs thoroughly and check them promptly. Avoid rewriting, even though it's tempting to do so when you see that you could have expressed something much better, at least in your own mind, than you did in the submitted version. but try to limit yourself to correcting obvious mistakes and maybe just tweaking the article where you feel that it's absolutely necessary. And of course, answer any queries that the copy editor has raised. Finally, publication. Without question, being published is a great achievement, so enjoy it and feel free to share your work with others. Engage on social media about your research. Consider writing a blog about it. Some journals, such as Social and Legal Studies, have a blog site where authors can discuss their work in blog form. Make your research available on institutional repositories, but make sure you're being compliant with the rules of copyright. Finally, good luck. I hope you find the experience of publication to be exciting and rewarding, and I wish you the very best of luck in your journey to getting published.